Think about the words we use every day. Ego, the unconscious, a Freudian slip. Whether you've ever picked up one of his books or not, Sigmund Freud has completely seeped into our culture. He's this absolute giant of 20th century thought, basically the father of psychoanalysis. His ideas changed the very language we use to talk about ourselves.
But here's the big question, the one we're going to tackle today. Was he a real scientist, discovering cold, hard truths about the human mind? Or was he actually a writer, a storyteller with a medical degree, who just told us the kinds of stories we desperately wanted to hear about ourselves? Scientist or myth teller? So here's how we're going to figure this out. We'll start with him as a colossus with feet of clay, look at his secret notes, and the trap of always being right. Then we'll touch on his idea that anatomy is destiny, reevaluate him as an archaeologist of meaning, and finally, see his work as the map, not the territory.
Okay, first things first. We have to acknowledge just how huge Freud's influence was. It's almost impossible to overstate it. Before him, the idea that we have this hidden, unconscious mind pulling the strings, that was pretty out there stuff. Freud dragged it right into the spotlight and boom, Western culture was never the same. But, even the biggest giants can have some serious weaknesses. Feet of clay, as they say. So let's do it. Let's actually dive into the evidence. It's time to separate the man from the myth. And believe me, when you start digging into the foundations of his work, that's where you start to see the cracks.
So let's talk about Freud's secret notes. Because look, any good scientific theory has to be built on solid data, right? Well, one of the biggest problems for Freud is that the data he used, the very source of all his groundbreaking ideas, was, to put it mildly, a bit of a mess.
So, forget about sterile labs and controlled experiments. Freud's laboratory was his own private study in Vienna. And his test subjects? They weren't some random cross-section of humanity. Nope. They were a small, very specific group. Wealthy, well-educated, unmarried Viennese women. Now just think about that for a second. Can you really create a universal theory of the human mind based on the stories of a handful of people from one tiny, privileged sliver of society? It's a huge problem.
And it gets even shadier, honestly. Historians and researchers who've dug into his work have found some really big differences between his private notes from therapy sessions and the famous case studies he published. It seems he wasn't afraid to, tweak the details. Timelines got shifted, events were embellished. It starts to look less like science and a lot more like a writer shaping a narrative to make his point.
So let's just recap the data problem here. You've got a tiny, super unrepresentative sample group. You have notes that he often wrote from memory hours after the fact. You have published cases that don't quite match the notes. And to top it all off, he destroyed most of his original patient files himself. It's not a solid foundation. It's more like a house of cards built on claims you can't possibly verify. And this whole problem with the data, it leads to an even bigger, more devastating critique. This is the one that really gets to the heart of whether psychoanalysis can even be called a science. It's what I call the trap of always being right.
Okay, check this out. It's a classic example, and it comes from the philosopher Karl Popper. A proper scientific theory has to be falsifiable, meaning there has to be some way to prove it wrong. But Freud's theories are like a trap. The analyst says, you secretly love your mother. If the patient says, you're right, I do, the theory is confirmed. But what if the patient says, no way, I hate her? The analyst just smiles and says, that's just resistance or reaction formation. The theory is still confirmed. See the problem? It's a win-win for Freud.
And that's the kicker. A theory that explains everything actually explains nothing. It can't make testable predictions. And if you can't test it, it's not science. It's something else entirely. It's more like a belief system. A compelling one for sure, but a belief system nonetheless.
Okay, so we've talked about the bad science, but we also have to talk about some of Freud's, let's just say, very outdated ideas. You have to remember, this was a man of the 19th century, and nowhere is that more obvious than when he talks about women. He called it anatomy is destiny.
On the one hand, you have Freud's view. He literally believed that anatomy is destiny. For him, the psychological differences between men and women were all about biology, specifically the presence or absence of a penis. But then you have later thinkers, like the brilliant Karen Horney, who came along and said, hold on a minute. She argued that what Freud was seeing wasn't biology at all, it was culture. It was about social forces that put women at a disadvantage. And let's be crystal clear,
Modern psychology and all the evidence we have today overwhelmingly sides with Karen Horney on this one. There is zero scientific evidence for ideas like penis envy or that women have weaker superegos. Honestly, these ideas tell us a lot more about Victorian Vienna's biases than they do about women.
All right, so let's take stock. His data is shaky, his theories can't be proven wrong, and some of his views are pretty cringeworthy today. So is that it? Do we just cancel Freud and throw him in the dustbin of history? Well, no, not so fast, because this is where the story gets really interesting. We need to start looking at him in a completely different way.
What if the whole problem is that we've been trying to stuff him into the box of scientist? I mean, if he wasn't a rigorous scientist, does that mean we should just toss out everything he said? Or was he actually something else, something just as valuable?
This is where a word like hermeneutics comes in handy. It sounds complicated, but it's just the art of interpretation. Think of it this way. A scientist can analyze the salt content of a tear, right? But a hermeneutic thinker, someone like Freud, asks, what does this tear mean? And that was his real genius. He wasn't a biologist of the mind, he was an archaeologist of meaning, digging through our stories and symbols to find their hidden significance.
And man, even if it wasn't science, this approach led to some absolutely world-changing ideas. He's the one who gave us the powerful metaphor of the unconscious mind, that what we're aware of is just the tip of the iceberg. He's the one who insisted that our childhood isn't just something that happens to us, but something that actively shapes who we become as adults. And maybe biggest of all, he basically invented the talking cure, which is the foundation for almost all modern therapy.
This quote from way back in 1893, this is it. This is the moment, the birth of the talking cure. The idea that trauma could literally disappear just by describing it in detail and putting the feeling into words. Think about how radical that was. And honestly, every single type of therapy you can think of today, from CBT to whatever else, owes a massive debt to that one single powerful insight.
So, this all brings us to the final question. Knowing everything we know now, the bad data, the sexism, the unfalsifiable theories, how should we think about Freud today? What's the right way to read him?
Here's the key takeaway. Maybe we should stop reading Freud like a medical textbook and start reading him like a great work of literature or philosophy. Is the Oedipus complex a literal scientific fact? Probably not. But is it a powerful story, a metaphor that helps us talk about the complicated, messy, and sometimes weird dynamics within families? Absolutely. He gave us a language for our inner worlds.
The best way to think about it is this. He gave us a map of the mind. Now, was it an accurate map? No way. It was probably full of mistakes, like those old maps with "Here be dragons" written in the margins. But here's the crucial part. He was the first person to convince us that there was a vast, mysterious territory inside ourselves even worth mapping in the first place. He pointed the way.
So in the end, maybe Freud's greatest contribution wasn't a set of answers, but a powerful permission slip. He gave us all permission to ask the most important questions about ourselves, to dig deeper and ask, why do I do the things I do? Which, of course, leads me to one last question for you, a very Freudian one. What old story are you repeating in your own life? Some to think about.